So what is photorespiration? We have photosynthesis, we have cell respiration, but what is photorespiration? So essentially speaking, when a plant has to respire, it has a little area on its leaf called a stoma. It's got what we call a guard cell on either side, and what happens is those guard cells during the daytime they pull tight and they create a hole through which air can get into the plant. Because otherwise the cell wall, it's kind of thick to get through, so it creates a little opening for it. It helps the plant respire. So CO2 can come in, some of the O2 can diffuse out that it's made, but also O2 can also diffuse in because there's also oxygen in the air. And when you think about it, CO2 is not very much different from O2. And so what happens when CO2 is replaced by oxygen? Well, remember, we need the CO2 because we need the carbons to make the glucose molecule. But oxygen is very similar to CO2, and it can actually take the place of CO2 in the Calvin cycle. If the plant isn't careful, this could become a problem. The cycle still happens, but we end up not producing glucose. We end up producing a kind of like just a byproduct molecule. It's not it's not PGA. It's just something that's not really even useful to the plant. It doesn't harm the plant, but it does take energy to break it back down, and so the plant is kind of wasting some energy whenever this process happens. But in the end, we end up not producing sugar. So obviously this is going to be a problem because the plant needs the sugar. So what do we do about this? Like, what happens? Well, first of all this is going to stop, because if you're not producing sugar, then what are you producing? And you're probably not using up you're not using up the NAD pHs. You're going to be using up the ATP. So this process just comes to a halt. So obviously this is going to be a bad thing for the plant. So what is photorespiration? It's simply where oxygen, O2, takes the place of CO2 in the Calvin cycle. Is this good or bad? This is bad. Obviously this is bad. It's not a good thing for a plant to have happen to it. So why is it bad? The molecule that is used, it simply takes the place, it takes up space, it takes energy for it to be broken down, and it essentially just stops glucose production. And so obviously that's bad. Now, where are some places where this would occur? Photorespiration kind of goes hand in hand with water loss. In places where a plant has to deal with its stoma being open, it has to worry about losing water as well as getting O2 in. So places that are generally places where water is scarce is also where we have to worry about the photorespiration. So what are some places where water would be scarce? Well, hot places, dry places. This is all areas where water has a potential to be limited. Places like deserts, right? Or just places that are really, really hot, and they can be humid too, like our area of the world, but as long as there's a drought or seasonal changes to the amount of water and precipitation and whatnot, that's going to be a problem. And so plants have evolved different responses to deal with the issue of photorespiration. So this is where we get into the C4 and the CAM plants. Remember, C3 was the temporary storage PGA in most plants, and for the most part that works pretty well for some plants. But if you want to get rid of photorespiration, you're going to need to change that temporary storage molecule. So let's look at C4 plants first. So if you'll notice on the diagram, this seems to be one cell, and down here we seem to have a separate cell. So up top the CO2 comes in, but it doesn't go straight into the Calvin cycle. CO2 is bound up in an organic acid, and guess how many carbons it has? Well, the name of the process should tell you, right? This is a C4. So it's not a C3 plant, this is a C4 plant. It uses an organic acid as that temporary storage. But specifically, a C4 plant stores it in a separate cell from where it does the Calvin cycle. So could O2 get in here into this first cell? Yeah, it could diffuse in. It 100% could. But it's going to have a lot harder time diffusing deeper into the plant to get into the Calvin cycle. So it's much less likely that photorespiration would be an issue in plants that that take the C4 approach. So how do they separate these steps? This is the top of the leaf. That's the bottom of the leaf. So two separate cells. So we would say that these are spatially separated, right? They're in two different spaces. CO2 intake occurs at a different physical location than the Calvin cycle. And so seafloors spatially separate these steps, which removes the likelihood of photorespiration. So let's look at CAM plants. CAM plants do something a little bit different. If you notice on this diagram over here, this seems to all be one cell, but the top of the cell is darker and the bottom of the cell is lighter. So what do you think is going on here? Well, first of all, CO2 is coming in, but it's also getting stored as an organic acid. It's also a C4, by the way. It's a C4 organic acid. But they're not, these, over here they're separated spatially between the temporary storage and the Calvin cycle, but these are not separated spatially. So how are they separated then? Turns out CAM plants open up their stomas at night. That's when they take in CO2. Well, if you think about it, during that process, it's saving it as organic acid. Is the Calvin cycle running at nighttime? Well, think about what the Calvin cycle needs. It needs that ATP and the NADPH, which it got from the light-dependent reaction. Well, the light-dependent reaction isn't going at night, right? It's got to have sunlight. It's not going to happen at nighttime. So it therefore stands to reason that the Calvin cycle does not happen at night. So it takes in CO2 during the nighttime, it respirates during the nighttime, stores that CO2 until it's daytime. Then that organic acid is broken down. So could O2 get in? Yes, it could. But the O2 is going to diffuse out before the night's over. And that simply removes the likelihood of oxygen getting in the Calvin cycle. So yeah, this is one big way to deal with this issue. So we say that these two steps are separated not by space, but by time. They're temporally separated. And different plants living in different areas have evolved these strategies to deal with the problem of not only water loss, but also photorespiration, which is a major issue with plants. So real quick, let's look at some different types of plants, and let's talk about whether or not they're C3, C4, and CAM plants. So first of all, we have these beans, just legumes, right? So this is plants, you know, just kind of like every average day plants, and they grow in more or less temperate areas. There's lots of sunlight, there's lots of water. They don't really have to, can oxygen get in? Yeah, but they're doing so much photosynthesis, they could probably spend the extra energy to break down that weird molecule that it makes. So these are just, beans are C3 plants, right? They're just C3 plants, just regular old PGA storage for carbon. So is rice. Grows in little rice paddies or rice fields, which has a lot of water in it. Lots of sunlight, so generally they're good there. But the next one is cactus. Cacti grow in places where you can imagine that water is availability is definitely going to be a limited factor. So these are going to open up their stoma. I guess it's hot here, right? These are going to open up the stomas at nighttime and take in the CO2. So these are actually CAM plants, a great example of CAM plants. Turns out most CAM plants are actually pretty thick and luscious and tend to have a very thick, waxy cuticle over them. So next we have beans, or excuse me, not beans, potatoes, and the potatoes are C3 plants, right? Just kind of grow in kind of your more or less temperate, warm areas. Then we have, this is an orchid, and a lot of people think, oh, orchid, yeah, it's kind of an average everyday plant, so we'll just say C3. And I'm like, oh, it's not. It's not a C3. It's not even a C4. This is a CAM plant because orchids tend to grow, they're called epiphytes. They grow on top of, epi meaning on the surface of. They grow on the surface of other trees, usually in the jungle and in the rainforest, where, yeah, it's really misty. That's why you have to generally mist orchids. That's usually how they get their water. But because they're not growing with roots in soil, they really don't know when their next drink of water is going to be. So they evolved to keep as much water as possible. Their leaves are relatively thick and have a nice big thick cuticle over them to help them prevent water loss. But they're going to be CAM plants. They're going to open those stomas at nighttime to conserve as much water as possible. Sugarcane and corn, these are both examples of C4 plants. They separate where the the processes are happening of storing CO2 versus running their Calvin cycle. Because the areas where these goes are hot. They also have a lot of water there, but it's hot. You usually grow most corn and sugarcane in areas that get a lot of sunlight. So I think corn, maize as it's really called, and sugarcane generally grow in places closer towards the equator. So like Mexico, Cuba, and south is kind of where it originally started. By the way, both of those species are species of grass. Just FYI, not species of grass. They're in the grass family, corn and sugarcane, both types of grass. And the last one is a pineapple. Just take a look at it. Think for a second. Look at the leaves on the top, and you could probably think, yeah, this is going to be a cam plant. It's a thick, luscious plant that likes to hold lots of water because it doesn't know when its next bit of water is going to be. And there you have it. So here's some examples of C3, C4, and cam plants, and we talked about why they do what they do. We can kind of see now, based on their body form and structure, why they use C4s or why they use C3s or why they use cam as their process for storing CO2.